Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, Boris Johnson. I'm standing in for Georgian Gatry because I want to make the case for what I think would be an absolutely spiffing regime change operation in Syria. OK, it might help those ISIS chappies and lead to World War III, but if it does, don't worry, I'm your Foreign Secretary. OK, Boris, don't call us, we'll call you. My name is Neil Clarke, and I am standing in for Georgian Gatry on the Sputnik. Now, it has been said of him that nobody knew Black Britain, its history, its fears, its hopes more than the writer and civil rights activist Darcus Howe, who sadly died this month at the age of 74. Darcus campaigned tirelessly and fearlessly against racism and the ill treatment of black people by the authorities. Back in 1981, he famously organised a 20,000-strong Black People's Day of Action in protest at the handling of the investigation into the New Cross fire, in which 13 black teenagers died. Joining me now to discuss Darcus Howe's life and legacy is author and fellow civil rights campaigner Tariq Mehmood. Tariq, like Darcus Howe, you were very, very active, weren't you, in the anti-racist struggle in the 1980s. Can you tell us a bit about your campaigns that you fought back then?
For sure, Darcus was a senior to us, and I wasn't active out of choice, but because racists and racism came knocking on our doors. So the 70s and 80s as a sort of a period, for us who grew up in Britain at that time, it was a period of intense state racism, street racism, gangs of Paki bashers. African and Asian youth and people were treated slightly differently. But in terms of our resistance and some of the legacies that I do share, is that we stood up against the forces of the state. And one of the important things I'd like to sort of try to clarify, that I am also part of the black movement. And a movement consists of many different levels and layers. There were men in the movement, there were women in the movement, there were youth, there were old, there were workers, there were community organizations. We didn't always share the same views on things. But what we did share was the commonality of experience, which forced us to unite on certain issues. And the divisions that may have existed were hidden and held back for the need of us resisting and fighting back.
Yes, and you were obviously one of the Bradford 12, weren't you, in that famous case in the 1980s? Could you tell us a bit more about that? What happened to you there?
We were told we had organised a defence. We had armed ourselves and organised a community self-defence because we were told that fascists were coming to Bradford. The police went round and told people to stay in their houses. We took the view, no, you cannot stay in your houses if your streets are about to be attacked. And if you're going to be attacked by armed groups, then you have a legal, political and a human right to defend yourselves in an appropriate manner. They were armed, we had to be organised, we had to be armed. But these are not race riots, these are not all black and white. These are periods in which fascists are political organizations. They're mobilized for specific events. And that's what we did. The police took this simple little position and built a mountain out of a molehill, really, and presented us as a group of terrorists who were setting out to blow up the police station and raise the town, which was complete nonsense. And
you were acquitted, obviously.
We were acquitted. We were, I mean, I conducted my own defence. There were 12 of us. We were all acquitted. But we wouldn't have been acquitted had there not been huge numbers of people in their thousands defending us, including Darcus.
Darcus Howe, is that where you first met Darcus, was it?
I think I met Darcus over the years in different places. But I was also on the demonstration following the New Cross massacre. But we had a long history of Afro-Asian unity. We were united in the black movement. It's not like of today, that suddenly the black and Asian as a concept is divided. We fought in the organisation I belong to was called the United Black Youth League.
Right. Why is that today? Why don't the black and Asian anti-racist movements come together as they did so well in the 1980s?
I think that there's no choice, they will. But the important thing is, what's the difference between now and then? When we were growing up, a lot of the violence that we faced at the time on the street was against men. And, you know, now the violence against women is so enormous. Now, that's not why there is a division. I think Islamophobia, the new the racism of the modern era of today, has created its own dynamics and divisions. so that when you divide people along religious lines, it's not simply along black and white lines. There are many other shades of grey in between. But the most important aspect here is, I think, that we had a vision. All of us shared a vision. And that was not simply fighting against that which we were fighting against, but also fighting for something. We wanted a better world. We lived with white people who were direfully poor, who were organizing in factories, in mills, in community centers. And incidentally, the poverty now is far greater
than it was in the 70s and 80s.
Absolutely. In some areas. And the sense of hope has gone. It's all a sense of hopelessness. The unions got smashed. Community organizations got smashed. The idea that we could build a better world, it seems to have slipped so far away because constantly the world has got worse.
Right. And the foreign policies of British governments and American governments have made it worse, haven't they, surely, with the series of attacks on Muslim countries around the world? How has that really impacted, you think, on the race relations back home and fueled Islamophobia, for example?
They didn't start in the recent following the American incident. They started way back. In fact, they've never stopped for 500 years. I can't think of a day when the British Army has not been involved in action in some part of the world. Perhaps your viewers can tell me a date and correct my memory. But the point is, let's not forget that 79 and 80 and mid-80s are not that far away. They were funding the Mujahideen, the so-called freedom fighters who were fighting against the Soviets and the communists within Afghanistan, and I witnessed it.
Yes.
Some of my friends went over to fight them. We had huge arguments. We had arguments on where do you fight anti-Semitism. We've said you fight it where it exists. I live in Britain. It's a form of racism. We fight it here. Where do you fight the racism that we are confronted, not by going to Afghanistan? You fight it where you are. These were not international brigades going out to Republican. These were very often paid people to spread really vicious, pernicious, dogmatic religious type of ideologies. And the consequence of that is a continuum. These are the very same forces that have permeated and changed and metamorphosed into what we see today. So the policy of the British and American government actually hasn't changed. What has changed is us and the forces that resist them. But most importantly, they no longer have the writ and the power to dictate anything and everything they do. But in the Arab world is particularly where the viciousness of their racism is so obvious. Which other part of the world have we seen such destruction as we have in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq?
Absolutely. Looking back at Britain, would you say, therefore, that the situation is better today than it was in the 70s, 80s? In some cases, the more kind of outrageous racism perhaps is less apparent today, but in fact it might be more subtle. In other words, that racism has changed its form, if you like. Today. Would that be a fair assessment?
Racism always changed its form. Nothing remains the same. The old racism has not gone away, but a new one has come in its place in terms of Islamophobia. And what I find ridiculous, it's reduced to hate crime. Hate crime, it is not hate crime, it's racism. Just got a different name. It's infinitely worse than it was before, because at least when now they just don't even pretend to it. I can't watch the BBC anymore. It's so incredibly biased, and also for all the mainstream issues. But also there is this smugness in the West. Somehow we have to jump to their agenda.
Yes, and we have the right to regime change in Arab and Muslim countries. We have the right to say Assad must go, Gaddafi must go. But of course the Syrians have absolutely no right, do they?
No, of course
not. To say
not,
Cameron must go. And that is inherently racist, isn't it, when you think about it?
I think racism is far more. It's an ideology. You can see the fibres of Britain being pulled apart. But it's not racism that will pull them apart. Actually, racism will weld them together. And that also applies in America. It also very clearly can be seen within France and within Germany and within Austria and all these Western European countries, that the racism over here is an ideological tool that has been used and perfected, not in a conspiratorial way, but as a system of holding people down. And in that sense, the situation today is infinitely worse.
Infinitely worse than in the 70s and 80s when,
70s and 80s, and if we had the extreme right or fascists, you might get 10 or 20 of them, like the National Front or its equivalents in different permutations of that time. and you'd have 2,000 policemen protecting them and tens of thousands of anti-racists. It's not the case anymore. Now the situation is the other way around. There are huge amounts of organizations, but the difference, I think, it is that there is a right-wing populism that's rising across Western Europe.
How can we explain that, Tariq?
We have history to judge ourselves. Last time this wave rose was in the 30s. The reason it rose in the 30s is because there was a huge crisis, an economic crisis. There was a slump. Everything was going down. And therefore, these forces raised their heads. When I look down in the northern areas, it's dire. The poverty within Britain is dire. Coming here from Manchester, there isn't a bridge under which the homeless don't sleep. My God, in the richest country in the world, you have people sleeping on the street. It's shocking. There is beggars just near where I live. Every few yards there are beggars. And they're in direful state. They're not, you know, some are mental health patients, some are just really poor. And when you have this sort of a thing, it's very easy to deflect from the central contradiction. And the central contradiction isn't the colour of skin, but it's political forces using that. And immigrants have been a clobbering stick for as long as I can remember.
That's a very good point, I think. You write fiction as well, don't you, Tariq? And that's a kind of escape, is it, from this...
Well, I think so. I think
what's going on in the world today, or is it...
Well, it's a world in which I can try to make sense of the, you know, the mess of life.
You have a new book out coming out?
I do indeed. I have a new book out. I was... because I've never known anything but war, and I asked myself the question, you know, where do these forces emerge from? So my story is really a 77-year-old Pakistani atheist who becomes a suicide bomber in Manchester. But why would somebody who doesn't believe in God become that? Fiction, I suppose, is the one world in which we can suspend our disbelief and talk, where animals can talk, the wind can talk, the trees, the moon, the sun, they can all give us metaphoric messages. But we actually now live in the world where, in order to survive, we have to suspend our disbelief simply to believe the unbelievable morons who rule our world.
So the book is called The Song of Gulzarina. The book's out now. Thank you so much for coming on the Sputnik, Tariq. It's been an absolute joy to have you on the programme.
Thank you so much.
Don't go away, because after the break we'll be crossing the Atlantic to discuss James Baldwin and the fight for civil rights in the United States. Welcome back to Sputnik with me, Neil Clarke, standing in for Georgian Gatry. I'm Not Your Negro is a provocative piece that has acquired an extra dimension and significance since the wave of reactionary politics brought in by Donald Trump swallowed the American nation. This documentary film is based on James Baldwin's unfinished manuscript, Remember This House, and is narrated by the actor Samuel L. Jackson. It explores a history of racism in the US through Baldwin's memories of civil rights leaders Medgar Evers, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., as well as their tragic and untimely deaths. With us today to discuss the film is the film journalist and director of Dmovies, Victor Fraga. Victor, welcome on board the Sputnik.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming on. And can you tell us about this film and why we should be going to see it? Why is it important?
Well, obviously, a lot has changed in the world in the past 12 months or so. When this film was completed, it was...
That was 2016 or 2015?
Yes, 2016. It was already an urgent piece of cinema because it basically holds up a mirror to the US and says, look, you are a racist society. It is that black and white. There's a lot of racism. Racism is pervasive. Now get up and do something about it. Since then, things have become far more serious. We have seen a huge reactionary backlash in the world. We have seen the racist politics of Donald Trump. I come from Brazil, where we saw a coup d'etat. There's a lot of extreme right-wing movements in the UK and in Europe, and obviously none of that works in favour of tolerance. The civil rights movement did achieve a lot. The film still talks about Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, who was doubly subversive, not just being black and an activist, but also being a Muslim, and Martin Luther King. All three of them were murdered for for similar reasons. So perhaps suggesting that the establishment wasn't ready to deal with such vocal people. Baldwin is so invigorating. His intelligence and his wit are really contagious. So the film is also very, very cleverly put together. There's an image of Doris Day dancing around, jolly, blithely unaware of racism, and that's contrasted with black people being hung in trees. So it's a film that's...
it's America in the 50s, yeah? Or early 60s, still going on. Yeah.
Well, people weren't being hung in the 60s, but the film blends images and events from throughout history to show that we need to do something about racism. So Baldwin died in '87. His manuscripts were unfinished. They chose Samuel L. Jackson, a name everyone will recognize, to narrate the film. That's again for a reason. So that we have had an American president, a black American president, but this is not to say that racism is entirely gone. And we had the Ferguson riots just a few years ago, following the killing of an innocent American teenager, the American Stephen Lawrence. And we are certainly going to see a lot of negative developments. In the film, at one point, it exposes American advertising of freedom in the 60s, so selling the land of the free, and contrasts that against police oppression of rioting. So that was in the 60s. If the film was made now, I think we could very well get Trump's advert of American First, which they have mocked all over the world. They did this Germany second, Brazil second. You've probably seen that.
Yeah.
So if the film was made this year, Ropak, who is Haitian, which is an irony itself as well, he would probably get that American First advert and contrast against the Ferguson riots. So exactly what you got in the 60s, still happening now. So the racism is still there. And the worst part is that the bigots are feeling energized with the election of Donald Trump, with reactionary developments all over the world. And it's very important that people go watch this film and that they do realize racism is not history. It's just reinvented itself.
Victor, is there perhaps a danger that by focusing too much on Trump, we kind of minimise the racism that existed pre-Trump and to try to make out that things were great, you know, before his election? I mean, economically, the poorest 4 states of the US are the states with the highest black percentage of population, the Deep South states. And that this is a problem that has been going on for an awful long time.
Well, that's certainly true. Trump is not the cause. Trump is the consequence. We shouldn't shoot the messenger. As you pointed out, black people are in the poorest states in the Deep South. That's for historical reasons. What we've seen, obviously, slavery came to an end, yet black people still denied a voice, and that's partially through mass incarceration. So people who have been incarcerated, who have a criminal record in the US, are not entitled to vote as a consequence.
How long does that last for? Is that 10 years, 20 years, is it a long time?
I think it varies state by state. I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's for life.
Right.
I think it's for life, depending on the seriousness of the offence or the felony or whatever they call it. But that does prevent a very significant chunk of black people, as much as 30% of black male adults, from voting. And that's one reason why the states in the South always vote Republican, because black people who tend to vote Democratic are denied a voice. Obama being a black man was certainly a huge achievement, but it didn't sort the problem of racism. Racism in the US is very much at the face. On one hand, because our American Constitution vouches for freedom of expression in a different way from the UK. In the UK, it's a little bit blurry. So basically, in the US, anyone can say anything they want. So you had people carrying out placards saying, "Get the out. We don't want the Negroes." and that would have been much less acceptable here. So that's bad, but on the other hand, that's also good, because when you see something so violent, people react.
So open and blatant.
Yeah,
like.
so open and blatant. That's why you had people like Malcolm X. That's why you had people like Martin Luther King Jr. in the US. That's also why a lot of the black talent in cinema in the UK migrates to the US. So Steve McQueen, who did 12 Years a Slave, he's British. He is Idris Elba, he's also British. So why is it that a lot of the black talent migrates to the US? Perhaps because the issue of race in here is much more subtle. There's diversity standards. The BAFTA has diversity standards. The BFI has diversity standards. Yet we're not seeing a very vocal black artist in the British film industry, not to the same extent as Spike Lee, for example. Spike Lee is a legend himself, and I think that's related to the fact that in the US you have the very aggressive reactionary movement, because they have freedom of expression, and the backlash against that. So people tend to be very vocal on
both sides, as opposed to Britain, where it's not so in your face, the racism. It's not so blatant, perhaps, and so we don't get the reaction to it as strong as in the US.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. What about Brazil? Can I ask you about Brazil? You're Brazilian.
Yeah.
Is Brazil a racist society? How would it compare with the US and the UK?
Profoundly racist. What I would call the US openly racist society, I would call the UK class racism, if I may say so, or classism. It's all.
That's interesting.
And in Brazil, we have cordial racism. A lot of people believe Brazil is tolerant because the ultimate Brazilian stereotype is the mulatto, is the mixed race. Sure. So people mistake miscegenation for tolerance. Brazil is a deeply mixed country, but that's not because people are tolerant. That's for very tragic historical reasons. Well, first of all, when the United States was colonized, whole families moved across there. When Brazil was colonized, only the male Portuguese moved to Brazil. And so they would start miscegenating with the locals, with the indigenous, the practice called cunhadismo. And later on, during the slave periods, miscegenation happened through mass rape. So the owners of the farms would rape the black women. So by no means Brazil is tolerant because, or is mixed because it's tolerant. So there's still a lot of racism in Brazil. We've certainly never had a black president. But, in Brazil, people tacitly believe that black people are good footballers and good musicians, but they shouldn't be really taken seriously.
Can I just ask you which countries you think are doing well on racism? If there are any you've been to or lived in, or you think have a very tolerant attitude?
I do think that the UK has done a good job. I do think that the UK is generally less racist than other places. That they have made huge improvements, and that's to do with the imperial history. People from all the colonies have come here, and so one way or the other, we had to get used to living with blacks, living with people from the Americas, from Asia, and so on. Obviously, it's nothing to do with the fact that the British are naturally more tolerant. British imperialism was filled with colonial ideas of racial superiority. So it's not that. But I do think this country has done a lot in order to fight racism. Europe might be a lot more left-wing in many ways, but Europe is deeply racist. Germany is racist. I mean, I look at France with Marine Le Pen now. Spain is racist. So you're certainly not going to get all nations holding hands together and saying we're going to fight racism, but I like to believe, and there will certainly be a reaction. Again, history is pendular. A few years ago, 5 to 10 years ago, things were looking much better. If I look 2 years back, I never thought we would be where we are now. We'll say with Marine Le Pen in France. Well, she hasn't won, but it's just the fact that she's doing quite well is quite scary. Trump in the US, a reactionary coup d'etat in Brazil. I never thought I'd see that just 2 years ago. But I like to think there will be a backlash. I'd like to think cinema is going to play a very important role in that backlash. I would like to urge everyone, not just black people, people of all creeds and all colors and all races to watch I Am Not Your Negro, because it's a film about being marginalized, about making your voice heard, about breaking some eggs in order to make an omelette.
Well, I'm going to go watch it tonight, I think. Well, you've been a great guest. Thank you very much, Victor. Thanks for coming on the Sputnik. Well, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for on this week's Sputnik. I've been Neil Clarke, standing in for George and Gatry. And, as George would say, it's been marvellous.